We tend to think that knowledge is a pretty good thing, that it can help us navigate the world, learn new things, and, if you believe some philosophers, enlighten us to a better way of living. But there is one thinker who flies in the face of this trend, a thinker who sees increased awareness as perhaps the defining curse of the human condition, and wishes we could all be totally unconscious instead. This is Emil Cioran. He is one of my favourite thinkers of all time, and I cannot wait to share him with you. Before we get started, I just want to note that Cioran is unlike many of the other thinkers that we've covered on the channel because he is deeply anti-systematic, even more so than someone like Nietzsche. His philosophy is often unstructured and communicated through short, pithy aphorisms that you have to then extract themes from after reading them. So instead of thinking of this video as a summary, I want you to think of it as just a few themes in the opulent garment of Cioran's thinking. And as always, I encourage you not to be satisfied with my analysis, but to go and read him for yourself. But let's start with this point about awareness, consciousness, and suffering, because it is perhaps Cioran's sexiest idea. 1. Myth and meaning. One of Friedrich Schiller's most famous poems is called The Veiled Statue at Sais, and trust me, I am going somewhere with this. It follows a young man hungry for knowledge as he visits the Egyptian city of Sais, where there is a veiled statue of the goddess Isis that no one ever lifts for fear of the forbidden things they might learn by doing so. The traveller says, "When I am striving after truth alone, seekest thou to hide that very truth from me?" And, after some deliberation, he waits until the dead of night and lifts the veil. He is found in the morning, pale and disturbed, and we get the following few lines. "What had been seen and heard by him when there he would never disclose, but from that hour his happiness in life had fled forever, and his deep sorrow soon conducted him to an untimely grave." The poem reflects a profound anxiety that many thinkers began to have over the course of the late 18th and 19th centuries, that perhaps there are some things it is better that we, as humanity, do not know, and maybe our happiness is only kept afloat by a series of fragile illusions. This is a theme that Cioran picks up in much of his writings. Cioran is often referred to as a nihilist, and while this has been disputed, I can certainly see why the label has been applied. Both in The Short History of Decay and his wider work, Cioran is heavily concerned with the conflict that can emerge between awareness or consciousness and the ability to find meaning or enjoyment in life. For Cioran, the world is, to put it mildly, just not a very fun place. He follows Schopenhauer in painting a fundamentally pessimistic picture of the human condition. This comes across most vividly in his work The Trouble with Being Born, which is a collection of aphorisms that often focus on lamenting his own existence. Cioran thinks of the world as defined by suffering for a number of reasons, but we'll stick to two for now. The first is that he roughly shares Schopenhauer's analysis of human desire, which paints humanity as essentially just doomed to dissatisfaction. Both of these thinkers are, in turn, drawing from a 19th century westernized version of the Buddhist analysis of desire. To simplify things somewhat, Cioran thinks that desires we cannot achieve cause frustration and suffering, and yet our wills will force us to strive after more and more as soon as one desire is satisfied. We can see this in action in our own lives. We think that we will achieve satisfaction if we just fulfill this one strong final desire, and then the desire is eventually fulfilled, and yet we remain dissatisfied. This is how Cioran, and indeed Schopenhauer, argue that the characteristic property of the human life is dissatisfaction. I have somewhat made Cioran's argument here a little bit more neat and analytic philosophy coded than it actually is. He largely communicates this point through a kind of philosophical poetry in his aphorisms. But nonetheless, I do still think this is, broadly speaking, his analysis of human desire. However, Cioran's pessimism has another key component. He would not be so concerned with suffering if the suffering was in some sense meaningful, justified, or capable of being redeemed. I really like the way that Carl White puts this in his PhD thesis on Cioran, which has recently been turned into a book. He is fond of saying that Cioran believes in sin, but not in salvation, and likens him to the figure of Job from the Old Testament, as indeed Cioran does from time to time. Cioran both deplores suffering and is totally unable to make peace with it due to his rejection of any kind of redemptive meaning. It is not just that he is suffering, but he feels in his very bones that he is suffering for nothing. This is a level of nihilistic feeling that not many of us will hopefully ever experience. Susan Sontag once claimed that everything Cioran said was already in Nietzsche, and while I do disagree with this, I think it's slightly overstating things, this is almost an archetypal case of a Nietzschean nihilism of despair. But before moving on, if you're pessimistic about the state of rationality in your newsfeed, then you should check out today's very kind sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that gathers related articles from thousands of sources around the world in one place, so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story. Each story comes with a clear breakdown of the political bias, factuality, ownership, and headlines of the reporting sources, with ratings backed by independent news monitoring organizations. Ground News are very kindly offering anyone who uses my link or scans my QR code 40% off their Vantage plan as a special deal. So I highly encourage you to snap this up. For instance, let's see how left and right-wing publications differed on reports that President Trump is thinking of pardoning Sean Diddy Combs. Whereas left-wing sources emphasized those who talked about the potential alienating effects this could have on young female voters, right-wing sources chose to emphasize the reasoning behind the idea that Trump thought the conviction had been unfair. I especially like the blind spots feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by either the left or the right. This feed helps readers step into the other side's news reality and understand the different narratives that can shape their beliefs, such as left-wing news sources missing a dressing down given by Cory Booker to his fellow Democratic senators, or right-wing sources missing claims that Trump's name had been deliberately redacted from Epstein-related files. I just don't have a lot of time to keep up with the news, and certainly not to examine every single article I read for bias. So receiving my Ground News Roundup at the end of every single day means that I can get a variety of different news opinions, learn which sources to trust, and make the world less of a bewildering mess, which all help to avoid the natural cognitive biases that would lead me astray. Ground News is giving my viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. They have genuinely become my go-to news source, and I sincerely hope that you'll check them out. But anyway, back to the video. Cioran often alludes to the idea that a permanent or semi-permanent peace is what would make life worth living, but since he thinks this is impossible, he is thrown into torment. In other words, Cioran thinks that, when examined with a cold and impartial eye, life is pointless and, moreover, full of suffering. Moreover, we are acutely aware of this meaninglessness and pointlessness and suffering in a way that we would not be if we were less conscious. However, Cioran doesn't think that there are no ways to alleviate this sort of pain, but he does think there are no honest ways to alleviate that pain, with one exception that we'll explore later. When he discusses the kind of things that would help someone cope with life, he often cites things like myth or legend, or just a vague state of delirium. For instance, here is just one passage from the short history about the rise and fall of societies. The activity of a productive civilization consists in drawing ideas out of their abstract nothingness, in transforming concepts into myths. Later, the citizen wakens from a productive hypnosis. The reign of lucidity begins. The masses wield no more than empty categories. Myths turn back into concepts. And here is another extract which focuses more at the individual level. Ennui shows us an eternity which is not the transcendence of time, but its wreck. It is the infinity of souls that have rotted for lack of superstitions, a banal absolute where nothing any longer keeps things from turning in circles in search of their own fall. Life creates itself in delirium and is undone in ennui. As we'll see later, things are more complex than this because Cioran also has real problems with the idea of myth and illusion, But this back and forth is one of my favourite parts about Cioran's philosophy. His almost total rejection of easy, offhand solutions. In saying that observing life as it really exists would lead us to condemning it, Cioran calls into question one of the paramount philosophical bits of received wisdom. The idea that knowledge and happiness are in some way related, or at least tightly correlated. Perhaps the most extreme examples of this were people like the Stoics, or even some Platonists, who, to skim over an awful lot of complexity, both thought that virtue and fulfillment were forms of knowledge. But we see the same general theme in Aristotle as well as Epicurus, and in Catholic Christianity through the idea that God is both goodness as well as truth. So when Cioran asks the question, can we both be aware of life's full pessimistic glory and still find life bearable, he is questioning this long-established orthodoxy. By going one step further and denying that we can, he is attempting to overturn this orthodoxy. This is what I mean when I call Cioran a revolutionary thinker that is definitely worth paying attention to. He is taking two pretty important pillars of our received value system, fulfillment and truth, and arguing that they tug us in opposite directions. In this way, I actually see Cioran as going one step further than Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer thought that we could learn to limit our roving wills through asceticism, and so eventually lessen the sufferings of the world and their impact upon us. In this way, he still does hold on to a scrap of the old idea that knowledge is the path to fulfillment, since it is through knowledge of our pessimistic condition that we would learn to become ascetics. But Cioran denies even this. In effect, he says that we have ennui on the one hand and ignorance in the other, and he asks us to pick our poison. And he really does see them both as poison. We've already seen what Cioran thinks of the knowing life, and this might give you the impression that he recommends an illusory one. And to be totally fair, there are passages that support this interpretation. Here's one from The Trouble with Being Born. Nietzsche's great luck, to have ended as he did, in euphoria. Nietzsche, of course, died mad, and thus presumably not altogether lucid. Here is another from his Anathemas and Admirations, which is one of his later works. I should like to forget everything and waken to a light before time. Cioran does often toy with the idea that it would be better for someone to live in illusion than in awareness. However, things are more complex than they first appear, and to explore why, we will move on to our next agonizing contradiction. 2. Fanaticism and Doubt. One of the main problems Cioran identifies with embracing an illusion, or as he sometimes put it, a myth, is that this can quickly lead to fanaticism. The topic of fanaticism actually occupies the very first section of A Short History of Decay, where he waxes at length on the potential evils or harms done by those with too much certainty and too little doubt in some grand meaning-making theory or structure that they apply to life. Idolaters by instinct, we convert the objects of our dreams and our interests into the unconditional. Even when he turns from religion, his need for fiction, for mythology, triumphs over evidence and absurdity alike. Once man loses his faculty of indifference, he becomes a potential murderer. Once he transforms his idea into a god, the consequences are incalculable. This is in pretty stark contrast to the earlier comments that we looked at about myth being essential to societies and to our extended motivation. And here's where we see another of Cioran's famous dichotomous tensions: the certainty and confidence to act, and the intellectual virtue of doubt. There's a bit of backstory to this that might be helpful. When Cioran was quite a young man, he had a brief fling of supporting the fascist party in Romania, which were called the Iron Guard. This is a stage of his life that he would later come to regret bitterly, calling it absolutely stupid. And this experience left him with the same kind of distaste for any confidently held ideological system that you often see in people like former cult members. So when Cioran talks about the fanatic who makes their idea into a god, this is partly a reflection on his own past and his own potentially murderous nature. It's worth noting that part of what originally drew him to the Iron Guard was that it promised to provide him and Romania with a purpose. Of course, he would later come to see this purpose as not only a lie, but a horribly destructive one. This leads Cioran to sometimes praise idleness and refraining from action as the ultimate result and goal of his philosophy, as the extreme other end of fanaticism. To quote the short history, "I resign from movement and from my dreams. Absence, you shall be my sole glory. I retreat before the dizzying farce of tomorrows." And again, later, "I wanted to suppress in myself the reasons men invoke in order to exist, in order to act." This is interspersed with writings both about the appeal of meaning-giving illusions, but also their immense danger, how they can animate us with a kind of infectious energy, but that this very energy can lead into fanaticism and tyranny without us even truly realizing it. But we can also immediately notice that Cioran has caught himself in something of an ethical or existential bind here. On the one hand, he thinks it is illusions that give us the energy to live passionately, but on the other, he thinks that they can also bring destruction in their wake. There are points where Cioran drifts very dangerously close to saying that the only way to live with energy is to become one of his fanatical monsters, though I ultimately don't think this is his conclusion. To quote an article he wrote years later criticizing his earlier work, including the short history of decay, one of the first chapters is called The Anti-Prophet. As a matter of fact, I reacted as a prophet. In the desperate fury of those pages, where it will be bootless to look for a grain of modesty, of serene and resigned reflection, of acceptance and respite, of smiling fatalism, it is the unbridled madness of my youth, as well as an incoercible love of denial that attain their apogee. This love of denial and of the negative more generally, I do think is a flip side to his earlier fanaticism about the Iron Guard, and generally seems to be the counterpoint to fanaticism more generally in Cioran's work. And indeed, Cioran's work, even at the end of his life, is haunted by this conflict between confidence and skepticism. He never did quite get over his dilemma about illusions, at least not philosophically. However, there are moments where a glimmer of a Cioran-esque way of coping shines through. The reason Cioran thinks that a great illusion can cause us to find motivation, energy, and passion in his fallen world is not because it appeals to our intellect, but because it appeals to our instincts. He is, on the whole, extremely skeptical of rational philosophy's ability to comfort us or motivate us in our suffering. As he puts it, compared to music, mysticism, and poetry, philosophical activity proceeds from a diminished impulse and a suspect depth. So, Cioran desires a motivating reason to live that is not prone to fanaticism or direct illusion, and he's also skeptical of rational philosophy's ability to do this. Perhaps this is why one of Cioran's only refuges from his suffering became the felt experience of beauty. Cioran praises beauty, and specifically beautiful music, for its ability to make existence seem worthwhile without casting some ideological deception onto us. To again quote him directly, "Everything seems debased and futile once the music stops." The other avenues he finds are, as you might expect, in poetry, theatre, and mysticism. He often references Meister Eckhart, the Christian mystic, despite his broad anti-Christian stance, and he finds in Shakespeare a genuine consolation to his troubles. His favourite musician is Bach, and he even calls Bach the answer to all of his anathemas. You can think what you like about these particular sources of consolation and inspiration. I really like Shakespeare and probably don't have the musical knowledge to properly understand Bach. They might not be to your personal tastes. The point that I really wanted to draw out is that the only kind of life-edifying factor that Cioran finds remotely acceptable is the non-propositional, instinctive, and artistic kind. For a philosopher, all the answers to Cioran's struggles, or temporary answers at least, are found outside philosophy. And as I said, they are temporary. None of these answers ever completely put a stop to his woes, and when his mind is clear again, his pessimism and weeping renews in full vigour. The reason for this is simple, but also pretty insightful. Cioran thinks that despair comes from the instincts, and that we need to soothe these instincts if we are to ever find even a temporary relief from that despair. You can really see the Nietzschean echoes here, but also one of his greatest influences was the Russian thinker Lev Shestov, who, among other things, claimed that we should believe in God not because it is rational, but because it is existentially fulfilling in its irrationality. His point is less ridiculous than I've put it here because I've really simplified it. Cioran just can't muster up the energy for a Shestov-style faith, but he does hold on to the idea that any alleviation of existential despair is not going to be achieved by philosophical argument, but by some irrationality. For Shestov, that irrationality is not just in believing in God, but believing in God even when you explicitly think you have no reason to. For Cioran, it is often reflected in art and an experience of beauty. He is not the first philosopher to talk about this. It's a running theme in the pessimist tradition. But Cioran is noteworthy for how personally he talks about it. Whereas someone like Philip Mainlander has a deeply interesting analytic theory of beauty, Cioran's reflective personal reports on his own experience with beauty serve as a kind of living philosophical experiment. Whether or not you agree with Cioran in the particulars, this does throw up another interesting dilemma for anyone who is skeptical about the idea that the world has or can provide a received or absolute meaning. If we as humans do create our own felt sense of meaning, then this does immediately come up against a problem. What do we do when these theories of meaning come up against the wishes or competing theories of others? If the avoidance of doubt is part of what makes those meanings motivational, then how do we prevent ourselves from drifting into the kind of fanaticism that sees Cioran? If we want to, we can broaden this into a more general tension in our philosophical maps of the world. On the one hand, we recognize that all of our viewpoints, beliefs, and opinions have arisen from a deeply fallible source, which is ourselves. We've been so wrong about so many things in the past. Why should we not expect to be wrong about much of what we believe today? On the other hand, most of us do not want to live in total skepticism, since that would potentially rob us of the ability to act decisively. Is there a way to consistently carve a path between the rock of fanaticism and the hard place of nihilism? It is an open question, and one that I don't think fully resonated with me until I was wrestling with Cioran's work. However, there is another theme in Cioran that I really want to discuss, because it's probably the main reason that I keep coming back to him again and again. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider supporting the channel by subscribing to the Patreon to gain access to exclusive content, including my slow-motion tour of the bookshelf you see behind you today. The links are in the description. 3. Seriousness and Frivolity. I think I've mentioned this on the channel a number of times, but some of my favourite existential philosophy ever written is contained within the first 30 pages of A Short History of Decay. Here, Cioran touches upon many, many themes, but I want to focus on the interplay between the broad concept of seriousness and the broad concept of frivolity. The section begins with his discussion of fanaticism, but he also discusses the notion of someone immersed in a serious meaning for life much more generally. We meet someone. We see him plunged into an impenetrable and unjustifiable world, in a mass of desires and convictions superimposed on reality like a morbid structure. Having made a system of mistakes for himself, he suffers for reasons whose nullity alarms the mind and surrenders himself to values whose absurdity leaps to the eye. Of course, the irony is that Cioran thinks most of us are like this kind of person, whose meanings and absolutes look so ridiculous when they are seen from the outside. The other kind of state he discusses, which I would broadly call serious, stems from the aforementioned ennui. Ennui is the revelation of the void, the drying up of that delirium which sustains, or invents, life. In some ways, we could view these states as polar opposites, and indeed, I've hinted at that in the video thus far. One assigns a meaning to life, and the other refuses to, but they're also united by this shared idea that the general question of meaning is one of the utmost importance. They are, as we described Cioran earlier, like Job. They are by no means at peace with the arbitrariness of life, but they want to rebel against it with all of their power. They are dismayed by the universe. They consider that they had made a covenant with reality and that reality had failed to honor the deal. This is very different from the kind of resignation that Cioran sometimes toys with. But at other points, Cioran sets up what I would call a genuine, full-throated opposition to this broad attitude of seriousness. He talks about frivolity. Now, Cioran's idea of frivolity is very complicated and quite obscure, but to simplify, we can think of it as the kind of natural lightheartedness that sometimes develops with a pessimistic outlook. I've seen people discuss this phenomenon in their own lives, and they normally describe it as a moment where tragedy turns into comedy. Cioran sometimes mimics this effect on a philosophical scale. To quote the short history directly, "No one achieves frivolity straight off. It is a privilege and an art. It is the pursuit of the superficial by those who, having discerned the impossibility of any certitude, have conceived a disgust for such things." Here, Cioran treats frivolity as a kind of existential irony. Broadly, it is the self-consciousness of knowing that any meaning that we do assign to life is arbitrary and just us trying to cope with the pessimistic reality of the world. This fosters a kind of detached distance from the sort of existential or cosmic concerns that could potentially really trouble us. It's clear that this state of relatively peaceful lightheartedness was only ever a temporary one for Cioran, because he only ever touches upon it very briefly before going back to his pessimistic laments. But they're also some of my favourite passages in Cioran's work. Here are two from Anathemas and Admirations. "When one has emerged from the circle of errors and illusions within which actions are performed, a minimum of silliness is essential for everything, for affirming and even for denying. There exists an undeniable pleasure in knowing that everything you do has no real basis. The fact nonetheless remains that in our daily gestures, we compromise with vacuity." And here we see a conflict that very much mirrors the others that we've already discussed in the video. Cioran seems to think that this frivolous, almost serene reaction to the emptiness of life is something of an ideal, or at least something that he aspires to. But he also seems to think that this is a fleeting state. As he said, as soon as we're out in the world, we compromise with vacuity. No matter how much the pessimist realizes in their heart that life is not a serious matter, their instincts, their bodily existence, compels them to earnestly care. As a friend of mine once put it, everybody is a nihilist until you slap them in the face. Cioran doesn't have an argument as to where this sense of lightheartedness, even temporary lightheartedness, can come from. He's largely going off his own introspective observations and the observations he's made of others. But one of the really great things about reading Cioran is that he is extremely adept at getting you to experience that feeling as well. I often flick through the short history when I'm having a really bad day, because despite the tone of lament and the focus on misery, it always makes me feel like the world is just not something that I have to take solemnly seriously all the time. We know this insight already at some level. It's why we say things like, don't take life too seriously if someone is upset over something that we deem not as important as it first appears. But it's a pretty difficult state to summon up at will. Reading Cioran is a pretty good way to do this. And there's a very interesting link between pessimism and lightheartedness more generally that I want to take a moment to appreciate. I've spoken before on the channel about the insidiousness of the idea that we can achieve anything, or that we should be happy all or most of the time, or that life is just going extraordinarily well for everyone else and we're just a hopeless loser if we're ever upset or disillusioned or have ennui. A touch of pessimism helps us get this sort of thing very much into perspective. It helps us realize that suffering is often unavoidable, at least at the isolated individual level. It paints our failures as nothing particularly exceptional, but roughly as we would expect them to be. It reminds us that there is a natural solidarity between us and all other people in pain, struggling with the inherent difficulties of being alive. Now, some may see this as abjectly disempowering, but just as often, I think it is a correction to our vast overestimation of the promises and potentials of life. To draw again on the Job comparison, Job is partly suffering because he has been uniquely singled out as, in some sense, cursed by God, or at the very least, God has permitted him to be cursed. How much better would he feel if it was not a cross for he and he alone, but that it was the general condition of humanity to be vaguely cursed? It would certainly not solve all his problems, but at the very least, he would not feel uniquely victimized by providence. But, as we said, Cioran only ever sees this as a temporary reprieve to his pessimism. In practice, he just can't stay this detached and lighthearted forever, because very few people can. I might even go so far as to say that I doubt anyone can, and I'm not even sure whether it would be desirable in the first place. Nonetheless, it gets at a seemingly paradoxical feature of much of pessimistic philosophy, that sometimes a set of ideas that at first appear hopeless and nihilistic can, on further inspection, be comforting and perhaps even relieving. And I partly wanted to talk about this light-hearted aspect of Cioran's work, his witty remarks, his toying with frivolity, and his ever-present self-consciousness, because I think that the dominant view of Cioran, at least in the popular English-speaking world, is ever so slightly caricatured. It's very easy to see his proclamations of life's miseries and just dismiss him as someone who wants to wallow in his despair. But if we look closer, things aren't quite this simple. Cioran is a truly agonistic thinker, but in a classically pessimistic, cynical, and skeptical fashion. He is totally aware of just how ridiculous he can come across. And he's aware of this because oftentimes he too sees himself as ridiculous. That self-awareness is another result of his philosophy. If life is arbitrary, then so are all of his complaints. His misery is just another strange, absurd little sketch in the history of the world, another concession to vacuity. The very fact he is talking about it at all is kind of humorous. Whatever puts me at odds with the world is consubstantial with myself. How little I have learned from experience. My disappointments have always preceded me. Cioran is probably one of the only philosophers I've read who manages to be genuinely laugh-inducingly funny. And whereas someone like Philip Mainlander, as much as I love him, often seems overcome by his own pessimism, Cioran is just as often amused by it. It is this ability to balance, or maybe just hold in tension, factors like irony, sincerity, melancholy, and mirth that keeps me coming back to Cioran's writings, even when I often take issue with some of his arguments, if you could even call them arguments, or disagree with some of the points that he makes. There are very few philosophers I would describe as deeply self-aware in this particular way, and Cioran is definitely one of them. And the self-awareness is not some personal characteristic, it is burnt into his philosophy. It is his philosophy applied to himself. That being said, even though Cioran is able to poke fun at his own misery, the misery is still very much there. So again, this ties back to our broad overarching theme of Cioran rejecting or just failing to find total simple solutions to his pessimistic outlook, preferring to outline a few temporary or provisional ways that he copes with it instead. But lastly, why is it that these themes have stuck out to me so much? And can we find a thread tying them together? 4. The philosophy of failure. Emil Cioran is now possibly one of the most influential pessimistic philosophers ever. Even if I think he is still underappreciated in the English-speaking world, he is an absolute giant of French existential philosophy. And yet, despite a career that most people would envy, he still considered himself a failure, philosophically speaking. He never solved any of the issues that troubled him right at the beginning of his writing. The very first line of his very first book, On the Heights of Despair, discusses the impulse to add meaning to an arbitrary and absurd world, and just how pointless Cioran finds the whole sorry exercise. Why can't we stay closed up inside ourselves? Why do we chase after expression and form, trying to deliver ourselves of our precious contents or meanings, desperately attempting to organize what is, after all, a rebellious and chaotic process? The section goes on to praise the kind of lyrical expression that tormented outbursts can give rise to, But I wanted to focus on this first line, because it suggests something subtly different. Cioran does praise lyricism, but he praises silence even more. His work is replete with exhortations to internality, to solitude, to remaining quiet about things. In his skepticism about rationality, Cioran perceives that the greatest kind of experience is the one that can't even be named and that we would struggle in vain to reduce down to words or even describe. So this makes Cioran an interesting kind of thinker, because he did keep writing right up until the end of his intelligible life, since he, at an older age, developed Alzheimer's. That is, he did keep expressing. This means he never actually achieved the kind of mystical silence that he had desperately hoped for. This is from Anathemas and Admirations, where he's discussing the French author Roger Caillois. We are all, of course, failures in some mystic aspiration. We have all recorded our limits and our impossibilities at the heart of some extreme experience. He even hints that his own philosophy failed before it had even begun. All through his work, there is the continual focus on failure. Many of his admirations from Anathemas and Admirations specifically praise their object's failure to achieve something. One essay is on the American author F. Scott Fitzgerald, and it stands out for specifically praising the existential crisis that Fitzgerald fell into after his literary success. Repeatedly, almost obsessively, Cioran pulls out the failures in all of us, but rather than outright condemn them, he often seems to find them strangely beautiful. For Cioran, all our failures pale in comparison to the primary one, the complete failure of anyone and everyone to fundamentally and finally resolve the tensions and problems of being alive. Thus, every success is temporary and dissoluble, while this magnificent failure looms forever large on the horizon. There is no permanent rest. There is only the dynamic flitting between bouts of ennui, bouts of enthusiasm, the comfort of beauty, the lightheartedness of self-awareness, and the pulls and frustrations of desires and drives. To draw from a kind of image that Cioran is incredibly fond of, healing from disease is only a temporary state, and decay gets us all in the end. This is one of the reasons reading Cioran can be such a great exercise for anyone who is interested in existential philosophy. Unsurprisingly, most existential thinkers spend much more time on explaining their solutions to matters of existential concern or talking about where they come from, rather than just sitting and explicating the feeling of existential dread itself. Nietzsche has a lengthy analysis of what he takes to be the origins of pessimism and of different kinds of nihilism. Most of Kierkegaard's The Sickness Unto Death is him explicating the various causes of despair and then touching on faith as a solution. Shestov's Athens and Jerusalem has an awful lot to say about God and existential comfort and the limits of rationality, but none of these thinkers go into nearly as much detail on just the base level feeling of misery and hopelessness and pessimism as Cioran does. Perhaps this is because they all, in their own way, think that nihilism is something that we can make significant and stable progress in combating, both at the individual level and at the societal one. Whereas Cioran is much more resigned to his fate, and if he cannot find the silent mysticism that he craves, then he will go on explaining his feelings in as lyrical a fashion as he can muster. This makes Cioran's work special for two reasons. The first is that it can better help us understand ourselves and our own bouts of existential malaise. After all, this malaise comes in a variety of flavors and colors, and Cioran is keen to document them all and feel them all himself. But secondly, it can reassure us that existential problems in themselves are nothing to be ashamed of. They don't necessarily come from deficiency, they can come from awareness and lucidity. And moreover, we should not expect easy solutions to these issues. For Cioran, we are overwhelmingly likely to be existential failures in just the same way that he was. And yet, as he doubts any permanent relief, he embraces temporary bars. Thus, if I were to try to vainly pick a single word to represent this aspect of Cioran's philosophy, it would be the word tension. Cioran sees life not as a problem to be solved, but a problem to be coped with in a million tiny ways. He never abandoned his life like Mainlander, so he must have found his own way of coping. But it was not some knockdown solution, it was just a series of scattered pieces of provisional consolation. Now, I was not sure exactly how to end this video. Cioran's work is so diverse and so fundamentally anti-systematic that it totally rejects any attempt to assimilate it all into some kind of neat closing thesis. Unable to resolve this difficulty, I actually sent this script to my video editor, David, and asked him what stuck out to him about Cioran's philosophy from what I had written so far. And he said the following.
Cioran's self-proclaimed ridiculousness, limbo, and refusal to offer solutions is perhaps the most human and honest reaction a philosopher can have to their own work.
And I think that he hits upon a very good point by saying that Cioran is an incredibly human thinker. There is no point in his work where he relaxes his pretty total commitment to the complexity of human feeling. It would be very easy for him to outline a theory of the problem of melancholy and then proclaim a quick theoretical solution to it. But instead, we have over a 50-year-long career where Cioran declares his own failure over and over again, each time making only incremental developments in his futile quest to make peace with pessimism. It is difficult to conclude a video about him because conclusions aren't really the point of his work. Indeed, he would probably deny that there was a point to his work at all. Cioran's philosophy doesn't have a natural ending. It's why scripting this has been an absolute nightmare. It simply has the continued balancing of numerous tensions, absolutely none of which are ever resolved. You could say that this makes the philosophy totally dissatisfying, to which Cioran would reply that it is only as dissatisfying as its subject matter. So instead, I just want to conclude with what I, personally, take from Cioran's philosophy. For me, Cioran is a thinker that can take us through the full breadth and depth of existential despair, through its lows, its seemingly paradoxical joys and its strange coping mechanisms, and the frustrating inability of reason alone to deal with all of it. It is strangely consoling to find someone who has already felt all the same things that you have in your darkest moments and put them into words better than anyone else I've ever read. While I am slightly more optimistic by nature than Cioran is, and I'm also slightly more amenable to the interplay between instincts and rationality, we all have times where we inhabit a kind of pessimistic spirit that Cioran explicates like no other thinker can. So, although the nature of his work means that I simply can't give you a neat conclusion here, I do hope that this video has persuaded you to pick up one of his books. I personally recommend The Short History of Decay just because the opening sections are so brilliant. But his first book, On the Heights of Despair, is also a great jumping off point. And if you want to check out some more existentially horrifying philosophy, then click here to learn about Dostoevsky's Underground Man, one of the most putrid characters in all of fiction, and also one of the most fascinating. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.